Hello everyone, good to see you. Nice little group here today and joining us on Facebook Live. Thank you for your presence. It's a great, wonderful topic that we get to talk about. Oftentimes we're talking about so much theology and philosophy, etc., all about the great doctors of the church and all, and here we get to talk about some people who lived and died here in the city of Shreveport 147 years ago. Those whom we call the Shreveport martyrs, the 5 priests who died in the yellow fever. And we call them martyrs because the word martyr in the Greek means witness, one who gives witness. And of course, a person can give witness by the shedding of their blood, and in a real proper sense, that term martyr is reserved for them. But anyone who gives witness, bears witness to the gospel message of love and peace and mercy, is a martyr in a sense. These individuals went into an area in which they knew that they were going to die. And in that sense, we can call them martyrs. I'll speak a little bit more to that theme in just a moment. But as we begin, let us invoke the saints, the blesseds, the venerables, and all saints of God as together we pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, there are so many people throughout history who have lived such remarkable, exemplary lives. We call upon them. We call upon members who are in the communion of saints. We ask their blessing, their intercession at this time. We pray through them so that we too may follow the example of those who have lived so wonderfully well the gospel message. And so, using the prayers that your Son taught us, and keeping in mind the intercession of our saints, the 5 priests, and our favorite saints, we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We are very ready to talk about this topic because 2 days ago we had a documentary team here in town, and we spent about 16 hours videotaping at Holy Trinity and at another location. The bishop, myself, our other 2 presenters. There's a documentary in the making right now. We're very grateful to the LSU Foundation for a grant of $50,000, which is getting us well on the way to the overall amount that will be required. We have talked an awful lot about our 5 guys, as we like to say, the 5 priests, the 5 martyrs, and even speaking in terms of the canonization process. Now, of interest is to those who are doing the documentary is the fact that this is not per se a Catholic documentary. It's the impact that these 5 priests had in the history of Shreveport and in northern Louisiana, which is why a public institution like LSU could be funding this. But they know very well of the importance of the Catholic Church and the foundation of so many cities, and certainly the influence in the state of Louisiana. In a nutshell, and then we're really going to flesh this out in just a little bit, in order to become a saint, someone has to... now, I'm talking about in this day and age, and Cheryl's going to go into it in depth with Urban VIII and Pope Urban VIII and all the particulars, but of course early on the apostles didn't have to go through a canonization process. A number of the other saints, by acclamation of the people, were held as saints and are still to this day considered saints. But today the process is that you have to be first a servant of God. A formal term is like capital S of capital G. Of course, God is capital S. Because in one sense, we're all servants of God. We're all meant to be at his service, but there are those who are formally acknowledged as being such. And then a person can be declared venerable, and then blessed, and then saint. Now, servant of God is something that happens on a local level in one's diocese. So that's why it was by the authority of Bishop Malone that he was able to say that these 5 priests are indeed servants of God. So on December 8th, 2020, some of you may have seen it watching via Facebook Live. You may have watched it and how he signed it, and then local press picked up on it, and regional, and now actually national. If you saw our Sunday Visitor a couple of issues ago, I mean, wow, how great that they were picked up by them. And we've had requests on an international basis. People who have heard their story and are sending in prayer requests or requesting information about the 5 priests. So, and certainly with the documentary, which we're hoping will come out. At first they were talking in terms of as quickly as April, but now, since this is going to be a longer documentary, we're looking at around September. While most likely the pandemic is still going on. So the notion of the priests who died in an epidemic, and that was part of our conversation as well. How we see similarities between 1873 and today. So the bishop of a local level has the authority to declare a person or persons servants of God. Then, now that we have heard from the Vatican and have received a formal letter that is called a nihil obstat, that there are no obstacles, there's nothing in the way, as judged by the Vatican, for us to pursue their cause. And I really should say causes, because it's 5 causes. Each one is treated separately. So we can pursue their causes. And what will happen now, it hasn't happened, but there's a lot of work going into it right now, is that the bishop will formally convene a tribunal, a fancy way of saying all the people required by Vatican documents to serve in a variety of capacities will get together. There will be a historical commission, and everything will be assembled in such a way that the bishop is satisfied and is ready to send the 5 causes and the portfolios and his opinion, the votum, to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints at the Vatican. So that is basically kind of sort of where we are right now. This time period oftentimes takes a lot of time because the historical research, there's a lot to it. And going to all the archives and the parishes where, in this case, the parishes where the priests served, going to their homeland, etc. But we've already spent 4 years worth of time, energy, research, resources, already doing that. So we have already collected an awful lot that will be incorporated into the materials that the Historical Commission will accept and ultimately present to the bishop. So sometime, I mean, people ask, well, how long is it going to take from servant of God to venerable? We don't know for sure, but I guarantee you it could very well be sooner than later. In fact, the bishop and I were talking how great it would be, in fact, we're going to make this a goal, that by the end of his time as our bishop, 4.5 years from now is when he turns 75, he is very hopeful that we would have already submitted information to the Vatican and that the Vatican would declare them venerable. It is the Vatican that declares them venerable. It is not the opinion of the bishop or anyone else. It's this Congregation for the Causes of the Saints who reviews each of the 5 causes and then presents them to the Holy Father. The Holy Father, having heard, not reading all the material, but having heard the final summary from the Congregation of the Causes of the Saints, the Holy Father will give his approval, his nod, and then the bishop would be informed, and we would call them venerable. So it is by the declaration of the Vatican itself. Now, to go from venerable to blessed, it's not the declaration of the bishop, it's not the declaration of the Vatican, it's a declaration from heaven. God. A miracle has to take place. And if it's a bona fide miracle, and we can talk about that more, if it's a real, true, genuine miracle, then that is as if God, heaven, giving that stamp of approval, that ultimate seal saying, yes, this individual or these individuals are worthy of the altars, as we say. Now they can have a special mass that is being offered and prayed, and we're praying through their intercession. There's a feast day now that we are celebrating. There are, right, so I mean, it's their stature in the church and the whole line of martyrs and saints has greatly increased. And then it's God himself who declares them a saint, really, if you think about it, because a second miracle is required. And there are a lot of people who are venerable and never have miracles attributed to them. And there are plenty of people who are blessed who have never gotten that second miracle. And there are plenty of people out there praying through people's intercessions. Well, so you have these different stages. It is genuinely my hope that in my lifetime I will get to see them venerable. To see them blessed, I don't know. I mean, that's really truly God's timing there. And will all five get miracles, separate individual miracles, and then we can submit them all together and the Vatican declares each one of them blessed at the same time? I just don't know. I mean, and the same thing with regards to being a saint. So I'm going to talk to you about praying through the intercession of servants of God, and then we're going to talk about how it is that we even got here by means of the Pope's document from 2017, and then I will hand the microphone off to Cheryl. Praying through the intercession of a saint.
Do you want to go to the end of the slides? Your slides it has
Everything I'm talking about? Did I jump ahead?
That's okay. But you have everything.
Is this the praying through the intercession of saints?
You can either start here, or you can go.
Let's do the praying through the intercession of saints.
All right.
Okay, so as you can see here, it is a work of the church. It's a very important work that the saints in heaven perform for us, the communion of saints. Remember, we believe in the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of our body. Communion of saints is everything that incorporates heaven, purgatory, and earth. The communion of saints, in the broadest sense, it's the church. We are, by our baptisms, saints. St. Paul used to always say, by your baptism, incorporation into Jesus Christ, if we're part of the body of Christ, I mean, how can something be a part of the body of Christ and be sinful? So basically, his whole theology is, you are baptized, you are a saint, now act like it. I mean, so, you know, put holiness there, and now we're supposed to live a life based on our baptismal promises. And so the communion of saints, I suppose, you know, if you capitalize it like it is here, then we really think of those people who are in heaven, saints, those who are canonized saints, and those who are not canonized saints. Anyone in heaven is a saint. The word saint, sanctus, means holy. Anyone in heaven is holy. And therefore, we can call upon their intercession. And whenever there's a miracle, it's not to somehow honor and glorify the person. I mean, everything done is in order to offer glory to God. Secondary end is the good of man. So, for example, the person who might have been the recipient of the miracle, or everyone else who is in awe of what has just happened, and our faith is stirred, and we're more Christ-like than ever because of a miracle that has taken place. Yes, that's a great secondary, wonderful secondary benefit. But the primary end, obviously, is to glorify God. God will many times perform miracles through the intercession of saints and those who are in the process of becoming a saint. So, and that's where we are right now. But you have to know how to pray through the intercession of a saint. And so, we cannot invoke all 5 at the same time or in conjunction with someone who is already a saint. Okay, so now, please, we need to make sure that we're good on this. And I really hope anyone watching or watching the replay of this really, take note of this, because we do not want you to get the 5 holy cards that say, and pray through the intercession. So now I'm praying through the intercession of all 5 of the Shreveport martyrs for my loved one who has cancer, and we're praying for that miraculous healing. You cannot do that. You cannot combine all. Remember, these are 5 different causes. You cannot say, I want to pray for whatever miracle to take place, and I offer this prayer through the intercession of the servant of God, Father Isidore Kemeray, and the Blessed Virgin Mary. So as soon as you add someone who is of a rank, and yep, that's one of a greater rank, then if they're already declared a saint, and you're praying through the intercession of Mary, well, the Vatican's going to say, well, guess whose intercession did it? Not a 26-year-old and 1 week old, 26 and 1 week old priest who died in the yellow fever in Shreveport, but Mary, the Mother of God. So you have to be super specific about your prayer request. You have to pray through that person. That's your one intention for this particular person. You're fervent. You continue in that prayer. And now maybe you've chosen another person to pray through for some other completely different cause. I would even dare say you need to write it down. If you have one of their holy cards or something like that, write it down. On such and such a date, I'm beginning to pray through the intercession of Father Jean-Pierre for my mother who has this cancer. And it needs to be very well documented, obviously, if indeed, please Lord, a miracle takes place. And so, if you notice here, these 3 bullet points. The prayer request, it has to be intentional. It has to be very intentional. In other words, you are thinking to yourself, and you know what that is. It's not a shotgun approach, like, dear Lord, please keep my mother healthy. No, this is a miracle, and it needs to be definitely, it needs to be organized in the sense of it's well thought out. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. We have one person in the city of Shreveport who, it was Father Kemeray who really spoke to him. He learned about the 5 lies. Father Kemeray really spoke to him. Why? Because he was the associate pastor. He was the one who always played second fiddle. And he said, in my life and in my business, and I'm always like the second one. I'm not the pastor. I'm not Jean-Pierre. I'm not founding parishes like Father Louis Jargot. I'm just the associate. And so he was praying through his intercession with regards to a cancer that is gone and has remained gone for a solid year now. We already have all of this written down. We have reports from the doctors. So it was intentional, it was organized. He had a sense of why he was doing what he was doing. And like I said, writing it down, just really, truly solidify it. Put it in your iPhone. I started today. Whatever it may be, it's in your journal, what you are doing. Now, a miraculous event can't happen first, and then you start praying through that. I know that may sound obvious, but, don't attribute something that has happened to someone after a miracle has taken place. And there has to be that clear connection between invoking this particular person because you want them to become venerable and the actual resulting miracle. Remember, faith in God above all. In other words, this isn't superstition. We are not calling upon people and holding a card as if it's a rabbit's foot and saying, okay, I really hope this happens, No, we're praying with absolute, complete conviction and faith. There's a real, that element of faith in God. He's the one who causes miracles. A lot of times, even non-Catholics will somehow think that we are saying that it's by the power vested in this saint that this has happened. You pray to St. Anthony, you lost something, and then all of a sudden you find it. We don't believe it's by the power of St. Anthony. It's a work of God, through whose intercession it was St. Anthony. St. Anthony's nudging him up there, as it were. All right. Miracles are supernatural, all right? Not contra-natural. They never go against the force of nature. So I can't say, okay, all right, servant of God, Jean-Pierre, I really want you to turn this into a living human being. And you're praying, and it's fervent, and it's misguided, but it's organized, you've written it down, you're writing. No, we don't go against nature. It has to be something that could happen in the natural realm, but there's something of a supernatural character. So it's in the physical realm, but it's metaphysical. It's beyond just the law of physics. So that there was a miracle declared with regards to a certain submarine that was going down, losing all of its pressure. The pressure of the water on the outside of it was so tremendous that they're trying to open up a particular hatch that would give them the buoyancy needed. It was just impossible. I mean, physically it's possible when you're at the right level, but the people of the submarine got together, prayed specifically through the intercession of one saint. One guy got up there and opened it. It defies physics. It's metaphysical. It's above physical. So, don't pray for anything contrary to the natural order either. And that includes, I'm sorry, let me just say this. You don't pray for the death of someone. Like, you know someone, and you're praying, dear Lord, please let that person die. Now, I mean, it's very different. Someone is literally on their deathbed. I'm talking about out of some malevolent intention that you just want that, I don't care if it's a car accident, I don't care. No. I mean, but you can't do that and then later claim that to be a miracle brought about by God through the intercession of the person you're praying through. And then for them to be recognized as miracles, well, I think that's your exception. It has to, the connection has to be there. It has to be direct. It has to be permanent. So, for example, so if this man's cancer comes back within 10 years, then the Vatican says that it was some type of a remission. But, I mean, so there's a 10-year clause in there, because you can't just say, well, they're cured of cancer for 6 months and then the same cancer comes back. Now, they may be cured of cancer and now they have a heart issue. They have a whatever, something different, that's fine. So I mean, hopefully that was clear. You know, how to pray through the intercession, make it very specific, you know, which, you know, so I would say to you, to anyone watching, to anyone out there, you know, get to know a little bit more about the lives of these guys. We always believe that the saint is going to call out to you. So it's not just we choosing a saint, they're choosing us. Some of you may remember when we had the multi-room filled with relics. You remember when that huge relic, you know, and that was one of the things he kept saying. Walk around, look at them, pray, venerate the individuals, everything for the glory of God, but read about their lives. But one of them in particular is going to call out to you, and probably one that you're not expecting. Something about their life, something, and sure enough, that's what happened. So I would say do the same thing. You know, are they people that you could best identify with? Is it, I mean, it doesn't matter why, ultimately. You might like the name. But you stick with that. You're very specific. It's a direct healing. It happens within a certain amount of time as well. And by that, you know, we're not praying since we're 5 years of age, and now at age 95, something remotely related to the miracle has happened. I mean, it's something, a miracle needs to be to glorify God and be for our good. And so, all right. One final thing from me, and that is, how could we even get to this point of them being declared servants of God? Interestingly enough, right after the 1873 epidemic and their deaths, I mean, early on people were like, these guys were heroic, virtuous, saintly. What they did and how they did it, I mean, I'm not just talking about the Catholics. There were so few Catholics in this city. I mean, it's kind of like today, where we make up about 7%. Back then, it was even fewer Catholics. And so, the Times, Shreveport Times, wrote about them, wrote very eloquently about them and their sacrifice for the good of their common man, as they said. And the anniversary of their deaths, they moved their bodies from one place to another to give them a real prominent position in the cemetery. And now the 25th anniversary, and they're still recalling their memory, and the 50th anniversary. In the 1940s, the people of Holy Trinity want to put stained glass windows in their church in their honor. And I certainly hope everyone has gone there and seen those, because they're really very, very beautiful, detailed, and with so many different elements in each one of the 5 panes that somehow represent that person, where they're from, what they did in life and in death, and just yellow fever itself. As an aside, one of the things that documentarians plan on doing is they're going to take some of the images and basically animate them as part of the story. The stained glass windows are going to come to life. This is part of where the expense also comes into play. But anyways, it's going to be worth it. We need them to be known. So, for example, in the 5th panel, it's Father Levasseur, almost 2/3 of the way down. He is on horseback. The horse is literally galloping. You can see it. He's coming from Natchitoches to Shreveport. And so they're going to start, you know, like out. They're going to see that. And then all of a sudden, he's running on horseback, making his way as we're telling the story of this particular priest and his departing Natchitoches knowing he was going to die. Now, in the 1940s, the bishop who was there for the dedication of the stained glass windows, he lamented the fact that no one had already picked up their cause and wanted them to be declared saints. And then he also said, and I hope that in the future, people are going to really understand what it was that they did. So, 1940s, now we have World War II, other things going on. I mean, so it took another 75, basically, years for it to happen. One of the main reasons why it became super evident that we could do it and do it now is because of the document Maiorem Hoc Delictionem, Greater Love Than This, from Pope Francis. July 7th, 2017, he writes this apostolic letter stating that there is a third way in which a person can be declared a saint. Then not just by the obvious extreme holiness of a person's life, or because they have been killed specifically because they were Catholic and they were proclaiming the faith and they would not turn from the declaration of their faith, so that they were martyred. But that there are people who put themselves into harm's way knowing that they will die. And they freely do this, a free offering of their life, this oblation of their life. So think about the chaplain in war who runs out into the battlefield. He says, I know I'm going to die, but I need to do it. And he's anointing the sick, and he's helping get people, and he keeps going, and he keeps going until finally he is shot and killed. Someone who puts themselves knowing that this is going to happen. And so, this motu proprio, that's the fancy term, of his own initiative, there are all sorts of reasons an apostolic letter can be written, but he himself wanted to write this letter. He wasn't told by a congregation or something, so it's a motu proprio. July 11th, I said the wrong date earlier. And it's all based on greater love has no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, we put that translation up there because that's the translation that the Vatican gave us with this particular document. Greater love than this, I mean, we've heard no greater love than this has anyone that. So, anyways, worthy consideration and honor for those Christians who, following more closely the footsteps and teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ, have voluntarily and freely offered their life for others and persevered with this determination unto death. So if Father Francois Levezoet had left the side of the bishop in Natchitoches, and it's a 4-day journey, horseback, and if he had, after the second day said, well, I told everyone I know I'm going to my death, but I really hope not, and I'm actually going to, I'm not going to stay there as long as I originally, no, you have to persevere in it. You have to, you're staying there. It's, there's no second thoughts about it. Father Pierre was the only priest in town when the epidemic broke out. A lot of people were leaving. A lot of ministers were leaving. One stayed. Reverend Dalzell, we've all heard of that road for sure. He was also a medical doctor. He had served in yellow fever situations. He stayed behind, and we're blessed that he did. Father Jean-Pierre, he did not at all want to abandon his people and the people of Shreveport. Father Jean-Pierre, this was his new home. Father Jean-Pierre loved doing what he was doing and teaching the people. He was multilingual. The way in which the church early on received money in which to build the first wooden frame church was because he was tutoring basically all the wealthy kids of Shreveport. None of whom were Catholic. But he was receiving the money, putting it aside, got enough, and he was able to build the first structure, the first church. And he kept this desire going. Father Pierre opened up the first library in Shreveport. He so wanted education and the opportunity for people to learn and etc. So he stays in town. He's part of the very first effort to I hope I'm not talking about your stuff. A little bit? So, okay, yeah, it just dawned on me that I'm probably hitting Ryan's. So, okay, so, all right, I'm going to leave that there. And then Father Temeray, the associate, was actually ill. He was in what is now Bossier Parish, the old Bellevue at a plantation, convalescing. He was called back. He came in. He knew he was coming into a quarantined area where people were dying. And he came back at about September 4th, and he died on September 15th, having completely spent his life. He knew it. He knew what was going to happen. Each of these priests did that. And that's part of the beauty of this, and that at no point were the sacraments, was Shreveport left without the sacraments. I mean, it was like passing the baton, and then sometimes 45 minutes later, that priest who was just anointed died, or 2 hours later. I mean, sometimes it was just that quick. And one of them will talk about the similarities of the pandemic today and the epidemic then, and the distancing and having mass outside, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, just to go back 1 year from there, the three of us happened to be on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and we were just south of the Sea of Galilee up at this Crusader fortress, Belvoir, overlooking the Jordan River, and so you could see into the country of Jordan. And we were talking about the fact that we need to do something. We need to make these guys better known. We need to write a book. We need to, the inspiration came there in the Holy Land as we're walking the footsteps of Jesus Christ and so many of the other saints. And then a year later, this comes out. Well, okay. How much more clearly could the Lord speak to us? And that's what we have been doing, because they fit this particular apostolic letter, the desire of the Pope that more people be recognized. The Pope wants more people recognized. And one final thing, and then I hand off the microphone. There were plenty of people who did remarkable things in 1873. There were a number of sisters who also went and helped and died of the yellow fever. There were lay people. But specific with regards to these priests, as opposed to just a number of the other people who stayed behind, doctors, nurses, telegraph operators, and others who said, no, I'm going to go, I'm going to stay behind. Most of them did not want to die, did not enter into the quarantine area thinking that they would die. A really good, fantastic, beautiful social worker who, out of love of humanity, could do a lot of what these priests did. But it wasn't just out of love of humanity, and it was out of charity, out of a love that emulates that of Jesus Christ himself, who made that sacrifice on the cross so that we may live. I mean, there has to be that element to it. They're following in the footsteps of the Lord, of the saints whom they knew, because remember, they're from Brittany in France, and in an area that had seen a lot of epidemic and pandemics and plagues and things of that nature. So they knew very specifically what they were doing. They were doing it for the love of Jesus Christ and for the welfare of those who were dying, holding their hands, whispering into their ears about it's okay. You can go. You can surrender. You're going to heaven. You're going to paradise. We believe in the resurrection. I mean, how wonderful to be able to be the recipient of the kindness, which so totally contrasts what we have to do today. People who are sick with COVID, they're behind plexiglass. The kids are over here. They're talking to each other via FaceTime or whatever it is. You can't see the loved one until literally they're literally about to die. Then family members can go in and see a lot of the. Fortunately, it's loosening up a little bit, but it's. All right, I think I went over my 5 minutes. I don't know, did I? Okay. So anyhow, yes, you do. There's plenty. Any specific questions that, because of what I said, were raised that you would like for me to answer? Are you ready to hear a different voice? You can't see it online, but they're all saying yes. No, they weren't. But anyways, Mr. William Ryan Smith is one of the co-authors of the book and has done a lot of research. He is going to bring up the rear and finish the whole presentation. And right now, Dr. Cheryl White is going to take the baton. You may be seated. And as we talk more specifically about these great 5 servants of God.
This is Ron's.
Oh, this is Ron.
I was going to talk about this.
Okay, just real quickly, because Father Peter actually did a great job of covering this process for canonization. But to sort of put this in some historical context for you, because you know that's what I do, is I bring the historical context, is to understand that, you know, across the history of the church, I mean, the estimates are we've got over 10,000 saints. I don't know that anyone has ever given a specific number. But part of the reason for that is because in the very beginning of the church, Father Peter used that word sanctus, which means holy. So in the earliest Christian communities, it was the recognition of the holy ones of God, who was by universal acclamation. And this generally included, in the beginning of the church, all the apostles and the martyrs. The martyrs. And that's what you see for the first 4 centuries of the church, really, is that we're talking about the holy ones. And remember that this is during a time of persecution, because it wasn't until the Edict of Milan in 313 that Christianity became tolerated in the Roman Empire. So when there is no more persecution, it really kind of changes the nature of the faith. For lack of a better term, it really changes the nature of the faith, because now Christians have to seek a new narrow gate. Martyrdom is no longer the narrow gate, right? Persecution is no longer the narrow gate during times, obviously, of toleration. And once Christianity becomes legal, and then the official state religion by the end of the 4th century, this new narrow gate takes on the form of what we call the confessors. Those people who lived remarkably holy lives, who found that new narrow gate perhaps in things like monasticism, in isolation, self-deprivation. So these confessors, we've got a sort of a new generation, if you will, new type of people who are considered the holy ones. Now, in that early period of the church, this was done, really, the apostles and martyrs were all by universal acclamation. Everybody in the earliest communities recognized them as the holy ones. That's what they're called. So once we move past that legal and state religion of Christianity into this new era, it becomes really the authority of the local bishop, the diocesan bishop, who would acknowledge the holy ones in his diocese. And this usually involved a pretty restrictive process of examination. We have an example of this, actually, from St. Augustine, who was the Bishop of Hippo. We have his model of how he sort of went through this process. But it was done at the local level, because there would be a local cult of devotion that developed for a local person, you see. For instance, have you ever looked at like the daily calendar of saints, and you've got the obvious one that's at the top, like St. Francis of Assisi, and then you read down the list and you get sort of the bottom of the list and you go, I've never heard of these people? Has that ever happened to you? So a lot of the reason for that is that during this period, really leading into the High Middle Ages, up to about the 12th century, it was the local bishop who made this decision. And it was someone who there was a local cult of devotion for. How many of you have ever heard of a man named Saint Gobain? Besides you. Saint Gobain. Okay, well, so don't tell that to the people of Wales, because he is one of their, it's very hugely important to their sort of religious culture of Wales. Very early tradition, very early local devotion developed to him there. And so he figures very prominently in their local religious culture. So all that is to say that by the High Middle Ages, the popes began to realize that because there were these various local devotions, that it needed to be made more universal. The process needed to be more expansive for the entire church. So the popes began to take control of the process, beginning with Alexander III in the late 12th century, Pope Innocent III in the early 13th century. So it began to be handled more in Rome, although you still see throughout the High Middle Ages the local bishop exercising a lot of control in the process. That all changes. When actually it's Pope Sixtus V who created something called the Sacred Congregation for Rites, and this is in the 16th century, that had the authority over both divine worship and the causes of saints. The following century, Pope Urban VIII creates the process really that we know today. He took that Sacred Congregation for Rites and divided it into two. The Congregation for Divine Worship and the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. So fast forward, and that's the process we've been using primarily, but fast forward to late, I guess, 1962, you have a Pope St. Paul VI who gives us the exact process. With a few minor modifications by Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Francis, it's pretty much the process that Father Peter outlined in his talk. One thing I do want to mention, and then I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, because Father Peter did go through this pretty well. Look at that first thing. The diocesan bishop receives a request for a cause. Do you know that any lay person can petition their bishop? I didn't know this really until a couple of years ago. Any lay person, if you know of, and I don't suggest doing this to our bishop right now, because we have 5, but any person can petition their bishop to at least consider the investigation of a cause for someone that they know who may be worthy of this examination. So the rest of this process, as I said, Father Peter has been through. The servant of God, the declaration of them being venerable, which I do hope to see. Father Peter mentioned, sort of his timeline as being maybe by the time of the end of the tenure of our bishop in 4.5 years. I have to say that I'd like to see it happen in late summer, early fall of 2023, which will be the 150th anniversary of the epidemic. So yes, we'll live to see them venerable, God willing, but I don't have many hopes of living to see them beatified, any of them beatified or canonized. It could certainly happen, but there are, of course, many cases of this in history where it's taken centuries. So I probably won't be around in that case. But anyone have any questions of me about anything? I want to hand it over to Ryan so that he can talk, I think, very poignantly about their heroic virtue and how it is that all 5 of these fit this new way of Pope Francis from 2017. Anything for me? Ryan Smith, you are up.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Is it working? Okay. So I prefer to keep my hands free because I don't think I can actually physically talk without moving my hands around. I get really quiet when I go like this. So I guess my role in this whole project has been kind of a weird, interesting, and unexpected one, but I guess I'm the chief storyteller. Is that kind of, I'm not a professional historian, certainly not a cleric. But the stories of these men, their lives, I find quite remarkable, and I like to tell them. So if you'll all bear with me, I will start with Father Isidore Kemmerer. I'll talk about them in order of their passing, okay? Because, not to be particularly morbid about it, but it follows the timeline of the events, right, of the epidemic. So we'll start with Father Kemmerer. He, as Father Peter mentioned, was a young man, 25 when the yellow fever comes to Shreveport. Although he's young, he's not particularly healthy. He's frail. If you go to his grave, it's clearly the smallest tomb. And it was a very small person, apparently. The basal tomb is very short compared to the others. He was suffering throughout his entire adulthood from tuberculosis, and he was particularly having a bad bout of it before the yellow fever. He comes to Shreveport first, we know, or we believe, as early as 1871. There's reference to him being here. Father Pierre has got a great congregation building. He's doing a lot of ministries, a lot of services around town, opening Catholic schools and libraries. I mean, a prolific organizer, administrator of ministries, and he needs help. And so he's petitioning the bishop year after year in Natchitoches. I need somebody. You know, I can't do this all. I can't go to say Mass 30 miles over here, on the same day go 30 miles over there, and mind the school, and mind the, everything we have going on. And so, of course, the Catholic Church in Louisiana at this time is very spread out in this geography, this part of the world. Few priests, few sisters, scattered here and there. And eventually, though, the bishop agrees. Well, he agreed from the beginning. He just didn't have anybody to send. But eventually, he has someone to send, and the bishop even writes to Father Pierre and says, "Okay, I've got somebody for you, but bear with him. He's frail. I don't know how much he's actually going to be able to do for you." And so, Father Kemmerer comes to Shreveport in 1871 to be the associate pastor at Holy Trinity under Father Pierre, and he doesn't stay long. He's so sick when he gets here, it's basically an extra burden to Pierre. And so that was not the intention of the arrangement, right? To give Father Pierre something else to do. And so Kemmerer goes back towards South Louisiana. It escapes me right now where he came from. Moroville?
He went to Moroville.
Went back to Moroville, to convalesce and try again. So he gets here, Father Kemmerer, the second time to be Pierre's assistant, a couple months before the epidemic, we believe. Is that right? Is that timeline correct?
Half a year.
Half a year? 4 or 6 months, somewhere before the epidemic. And at this time, he's got his feet under him. He's performing baptisms, he's doing funerals, weddings. He's really freeing up Father Pierre to continue his service and to grow the ministries up here. Things are going quite well until the summer of 1873, and young Kemmerer gets ill again. Tuberculosis, flare-up, whatever you call it. Forgive me, I'm not a physician. I just work in a hospital. And he goes to convalesce near Bellevue in Bossier Parish, Louisiana, on a farm there of a devout Catholic family. They provide him shelter, and he's away in a more hilly, hospitable climate out of the city that was believed to be very dirty, and disgusting, and unhealthy to live in Shreveport at that time. And he goes and lays up, basically, to convalesce. Well, a month later, weeks later, he gets a note from Father Pierre requesting him to come back. There's something brewing in Shreveport, and it's not good, and his help is urgently needed. And so we have this first free offering of life. You have to consider the state of, first of all, how desperate Father Pierre was to ask for Kemmerer to come back, knowing how sick he was. And then on the other side of that coin, you have, the other side of that river, you have young Kemre, who's bedridden, hardly well. And now he is going to come into the quarantine. And so, on horseback, right, 1873, he's clinging to life already, comes to the river, crosses the river at the ferry, enters the quarantine, never to leave again. I particularly was confused at first when we first started this project because Father Pierre's name is in the earliest documentation of the organized relief efforts of Shreveport during the yellow fever outbreak. And Kemre's name is not. And I was kept thinking, well, surely he was there. He was in those same meetings with his pastor. Why is he absent? Well, that's when we realized later through some other archival finds that he was convalescing and he was not in Shreveport. He had to enter into the quarantine. So his name, Kemre's name, is absent from some of the early documentation, although it does appear. And we do now believe that he was working in Fever Ward 2. The city was divided into 4 fever wards, roughly 28 blocks each. And, it wasn't a perfect square or rectangle, so some wards had more blocks than others. But they divided it based on population density. So Fever Ward 2 was on the more southern part of the town. Southeast part of the town bordered the river. The northern border was the south side of Texas Street and down, bordered by the river on the east side, and on the west side by Common Street. I can't remember the name of the street on the southern side. It might have just been Silver Lake, for that matter. Probably was. And so, in Fever Ward 2, Father Kemre would likely, I haven't found the direct documentation just yet, and maybe we never will, but it seems very obvious that he would have been working in Talley's Opera House, which was converted into a giant open bay sick hospital for fever victims. It was a grand hall, large open room, elaborately furnished. I mean, think of the Strand, right? And remove all of the chairs and seating, and just set up cots everywhere with all of the sick. And so it seems very likely, quite logical, that Father Kemre would have been working in that hospital. So he gets to Shreveport about September 4. The epidemic, the fever, is declared September 2nd, officially by the city fathers, the medical community in town. Shreveport Times denies it forever and ever until the Shreveport Times staff is dying themselves, and then they change their mind and think, oh, maybe something really is happening here. And so September 4, Kemre's birthday is September 9th. He turns 26 years old. And so, it's a little graphic to think of it, but, he spent his 26th birthday catching vomit and wiping fevered brows. I mean, that's most likely what he was doing with his life on his birthday. He is immediately recorded, Mother Mary Hyacinth, other witnesses say that he's just utterly working himself to exhaustion. He's probably exhausted when he got here, but now he's nursing the sick and dying, 24/7 probably, catching a little sleep when he can. And he is laid up again. He soon becomes one of those convalescing and no longer one of those nursing, and dies rather quickly because of his fragile state. And so we know, we can see very clearly in that timeline of events, his frail condition, the fact that he enters the quarantine willingly. I guess he could have pretended to have not received Father Pierre's letter, right? That would have been a very human response. Wallace probably not even blamed him for that, but he came. And it's not like he just hopped in a car and went 5 miles down the road, across the bridge. He got on a horse. And he rode for miles and miles and miles, and enters a quarantine that was patrolled by armed men to die for others that he did not know. And so we see very clearly in young Isidore Kemre his offering of life, his free offering of life. There was very little hope that he would ever survive this. He had to have known that. It's just absolutely obvious. Father Pierre must have known that when he wrote to him. Again, I don't think Father Pierre was a selfish man. I think that was the gravity of the situation. That illustrates that very well. Father Kemre dies September 15th, 14th, 15th. They have to keep me straight. Sometimes I get my little dates mixed up and things, but And so that brings us to Father Pierre. So Father Pierre is quite the cleric. He's the administrator. He's the organizer. He gets to Louisiana in the 1850s. He's sent as a missionary from Brittany, France. He is sent by Bishop Martin of Natchitoches. The Diocese of Natchitoches at that time was, as many of you know, most of the state. I mean, it was, the large portion of North Louisiana. And so this huge remote wilderness with just scattered population centers and very few Catholics even in those centers. And so Father Pierre is sent up here. He founds missions and chapels and churches and communities across North Louisiana. And I'm not the best one to get into all of that as far as the history of his time and all of his great efforts. I'm much more laser focused on the academic part, but when he gets to Shreveport shortly before the Civil War, he arrives at a town that's built for commerce. It's built for profit. I mean, it's here because the river port is in conjunction with the Texas Trail, and there's lots of speculation and cheap housing and land, and it's sort of this booming, just weird frontier town. In Shreveport at that time, up to a fourth of the population was not even born in America. They were immigrants from Europe, by and large, coming here to sort of take advantage of the American dream and build businesses and prosper. And so you have that community with the landed gentry, right? The plantation owners, the slave owners, those with incredible wealth built on the backs of other unfortunate people. And then you have the riverboatmen, the people that work on the riverboats, the Irish laborers, the Italians, those that come and work for pennies a day, very brutal and grueling jobs. Those are the Catholics, right? They're not the merchants, they're not the landowners, they're not the slavers. Those are the guys working the riverboats and their families. Those are by and large the Catholics in Shreveport. And so that's his congregation to pull from. What does Father Pierre do, though? He is multilingual, incredibly educated, driven, restless man. He wants to bring culture and class and things in education to Shreveport so desperately. The town needs it so desperately to sort of become the next step in a town. And so he has the idea to found the first public library. Not public because there's no taxpayer money in it, but open to the public, I should say. And so he organizes a subscription service. You pay so much each month, and then you can check out these books, and you bring them back, and this helps us buy new books, and we'll get books off the steamboats from New Orleans and all over the world, and it's sort of like a little Amazon precursor, right? So we can bring education to this town. And speaking of education, how does Father Pierre make his money? Because the going rate for a Catholic priest, I mean, in the 1870s, there's probably not a lot of money there. What does he do? How does he build his first church? Father Peter told you, sort of foreshadowed that for us. He, again, is one of the few highly educated people in town of any means. And so he hires himself out to tutor the wealthy, the children of the elite in town. None of them are Catholic. Absolutely not. Very many of them are Jewish merchants. They're Protestant landowners. They're all kinds of people that were not like Father Pierre. But that's okay. He tutors their children. He earns their trust. He pockets the money for a little while until he has enough to build a church. And that's exactly what he does. And what does he do? He builds the first Holy Trinity Catholic Church, the first Catholic church in Shreveport, 1856. Sometimes I say 58, just depends on when you hear me talk. So, okay, the second church was 58. See, there's a reason. Shortly after that, you got a church, you need a school, right? I mean, I know if you're online, you don't really have perspective of what I'm saying, perhaps, but we have the beautiful church here, and we have the beautiful school over there. So we got a Catholic church, we need a Catholic school. So he opens up St. Mary's School for Boys. Got to educate the girls too. And so he has this idea, which he does without the bishop's permission. He kind of gets his hand slapped for this. there's this defunct plantation south of town called Fairfield. And, you know, thank God, the slave economy is gone, but that also means that the economy has to be transformed. There's lots of farms that are very cheap right now. And so Fairfield is one of those farms, and after the Civil War, and Father Pierre says, I can get this land for pennies on the dollar. It's already got a big house on it. It's got outbuildings. I see a school here. And so we have the convent open up on Fairfield, which is today the site of the Catholic Center, right? And so he kind of, you know, tells the bishop afterwards what he did. And but again, thank God his foresight in that, and it's been a beautiful service for this town. Continues, ministries continue there to this day. And so that just sort of gives you, I think, a little flavor for Father Pierre and just how restless he was and what a builder he was and a dreamer. But he was also very pious. In fact, he was so pious that some people in the town doubted how genuine he was. Like nobody's really that holy. I mean, come on. Like, you know, he's got to be drunk or something, right? I mean, like, he's got some skeletons in the closet. And so Mother Hyacinth writes in her letters about defending his character because people are just so disbelieving that this person could be here in Shreveport. Like, how do we have this person? There's got to be something going on here. Of course, we know now there wasn't. We've been examining his life for years, and we've found nothing to blemish his character. But how remarkable that was, and you just think of, you know, the rumor mills and jealousies and the very human reaction to someone like this in their community, right? So, all that said, September 1st, 1873, Father Pierre is one of the first, he's one of 19 men. At first, it was all men. That changed very quickly. But first wave of volunteer relief was 19 men. They called themselves the Howard Association. They met in the Board of Trade Hall on Texas Street in downtown Shreveport, September 1st, 10 in the morning, and said, what are we going to do? Let me back up. Why did they call themselves the Howard Association? So the Howard Association was a movement that came from the 1840s, 1850s out of England, studying the slums conditions, prison conditions, first public health sort of outcries, that Victorian era where you can all picture the tenement housing, the factories and all that stuff, and all of the terrible social conditions of that time. So the Howards were a movement that started in England to see how do we better what they termed the sick poor. How do we better the lives of the sick poor? And so that's exactly what the Howard Association had in mind for Shreveport. There was an existing organization in New Orleans and one in St. Louis. Those were the closest chapters. Basically, it was private citizens of different backgrounds. You could have merchants, you could have clergy, you could have doctors, you could have nurses, people with different skill sets, we would say today, coming together, gathering funds, and figuring out a relief organization for whatever plague was in your town that year. And so that's what the Howards were in Shreveport. Okay, so they started September 1st. Father Pierre is there. We know he's there. He's recorded as being there in the Shreveport Times. And he's assigned to Fever Ward 1. It's 28 blocks of the city, north side of Texas Street to Caddo, I think it is, bounded on the east by the river and on the west by Common. 28 blocks, lots of people there, highly densely populated. Let me give you an idea of, there was so many people coming to Shreveport that there wasn't enough housing for them. And so people were living stacked on top of each other in these boarding houses, these converted warehouses and wharfs and places. And on Travis Street alone, we know that in one boarding house, 22 people died of the epidemic. 22 in one boarding house alone. And so that was in Fever Ward 1, right? And so that is where undoubtedly Father Pierre was ministering. What does that look like? What is the daily job of a Howard Association nurse? Well, obviously Father Pierre he's a cleric first, so he's giving last rites if they happen to be Catholic. He's saying prayers with them, caressing their holding. We know he liked to hold their hands, which is remarkable because they believed yellow fever was transmitted through personal contact. So if he was willing to pray with them and hold their hands, then obviously he was not caring for himself in that moment. There was no gloves. There was no medical gloves. There were no surgical masks when he was in the room with these fever victims. He was breathing the same air as them. That was the other way they thought you got the disease, was to breathe the air exhaled from the fever victims. And so you can imagine that obviously he knew, or at least he thought he knew, that he would die, because he could not have behaved that way otherwise. But we know he did. Eyewitness accounts tell us that he was a handholder as he prayed by the bedside. And so they would go house to house, boarding house to boarding house. For the commercial properties on Texas and on other streets downtown, there was often living quarters above, right? In those times, and so they would go up those side steps into the house and knock and see if anyone needed assistance or something. They would bring ice. Ice was being shipped in downriver. It was, that time it was called heroic medicine. So you had to lessen the fever. So you made people as hot as possible or as cold as possible. You alternate compresses, and you're just trying to change the body temperature basically. And they thought that might have a chance to survive that way. And so that's some of the duties he would be doing. Of course, there were doctors and nurses, genuine doctors and nurses in town, such as they were at that time, administering medicines that were largely poisonous, but thinking they were doing the right thing. But he would have gone house to house, and we know later. So Sister Mary Martha from the Daughters of the Cross at Fairfield joins him later. I say later, just a couple of days later. Ultimately working to her death. She dies of yellow fever, just as Father Pierre does. And we have this eyewitness account of them knocking on the door of a house in the fever ward and being motioned to come inside. The frantic father basically thrusts a dying infant, his daughter, into the arms of Sister Mary Martha and grabs Father Pierre by the arm. Says, "Come see my wife. She's next." 10 minutes? I gotta kill some people in 10 minutes. So, baby dies, mama probably dies. That's another eyewitness account of Father Pierre's sacrifice. Father Pierre himself succumbs to the fever, has no knowledge that Father Kemeray dies at first, or if he did, he forgot his delirium. But he dies the day after Father Kemeray, on September 16th, right? Third priest, Father Millet, is the head chaplain at the convent of Fairfield. Father Millet is an interesting character as well, for probably some different reasons. I'll stop short and say he was reluctant to come to Louisiana, not to the epidemic. Don't get me wrong. He came very willingly to the epidemic, but he wasn't a big fan of the Louisiana climate. Who can blame him? He came from a much more temperate region of the world, beautiful Brittany, France. He is the only of the five who is noted as having a hard time picking up on English. So he was really struggling sort of with the culture. He's at the convent with the nuns by himself, I guess the only man, and so maybe there's some of that going on, and he's just kind of lonely, I think, but a little bit more of a struggle for him in America is, Louisiana in particular is. But when he gets word from Father Pierre feels himself getting sick before he dies. He says, "Please come to my aid." When he gets that word, he comes immediately for Shreveport. Not only does he come immediately for Shreveport, he comes with a vengeance. In particular, what we know for him is that he worked at least until midnight every day, often into the wee hours of the morning, and only stopped to eat once a day after midnight, slept a little bit, got back on his horse, and came back to Shreveport. He liked to stay at the convent. He would come back, if you can imagine, he would ride on horseback the 3 miles back to Fairfield and go into the city each day. But we know he worked until well after midnight each day that he was working. He himself eventually fell ill. Before doing so, he recognized the telltale signs of his body. And my gosh, he would have been an expert in yellow fever in a matter of hours. If you consider in the height of the epidemic, which he was working, you had up to 30 people dying a day. I think the worst day was 32. So I think he'd be quite an expert very quickly. And so when he felt himself coming down with the illness, he writes, he sends off telegraphs to Monroe and Natchitoches requesting assistance. And so Father Gergaud gets this telegraph from his friend, his confrere. They knew each other well. It says, other priests of the city have died. I am all alone here. Please come to my aid. Father Gergaud replies immediately, leaving by first stagecoach tonight. I really hate that I can't get into Father Gergaud if I've only got like 5 minutes. But from Monroe, Father Gergaud from Monroe. We back up just a little bit here. So when Father Gergaud gets assigned to Monroe, talk about a culture shock for him. He gets there before the Civil War, quite literally one of maybe 3 Catholics for miles. He is not a fan of slavery, and he makes that very clear in his letters home to France. He very publicly, well, let's just say he baptized more than 260 enslaved persons before the Civil War. It moved him so much to see their horrific conditions, their lives. This was very foreign to him. Remember, he comes from France. This is a very foreign thing to him. And so it rips his heart. And how does the local white population respond to Father Gergaud baptizing their slaves? Well, the children throw rocks at him. He's ridiculed. He's ostracized. When he finally has enough money to build a little rectory in church proper, well, it's just one building. He lives there and he prays there. At first in Monroe, a wealthy person in town buys the property right next door and builds a saloon up 2 inches from the church hall, just to spite it. And so one night, Father Gergaud is having his favorite meal. His favorite meal is Vienna sausages and Burgundy wine. And so he's having his favorite meal inside. He hears a knock at the door. Before he can open the door, 2 men enter, clearly intoxicated, from the saloon next door. And they basically tell him that they're going to kick him out of town, that no one asked him to be there, they didn't like him there, and he needs to leave. Well, Father Gergaud, they probably didn't realize, maybe, was a big man. He was a man's man. He was tough. He was an imposing figure, both physically and spiritually. And so all Father Gergaud has to do is set down his glass of wine casually and stand up and tell them to leave his house, and they do. So, fast forward another decade, he is now beloved in Monroe. They see how genuine of a person he is. They see how much of a Christian he is. They see his ministries. They see his works in town. He himself is opening schools, founding parishes, doing all kinds of great stuff for the community. And when he gets this telegram to go, I guess the telegraph operator was the local crier. I mean, it spread through town. And so a crowd forms in the streets as he's getting on the stagecoach, and they're telling him that you can't go. You know, you're going to die. What if the fever comes here? You're going to abandon us. And he says, it is my duty and I must go. He says to his assistant pastor, write to the bishop, tell him I'm going to my death. It is my duty and I must go. And so he's on the stagecoach to Shreveport, crosses over the river. And I love to think about the ferryman. And what if it was the same ferryman that brought Camaret over? Here you have another Catholic priest coming from the west, entering the quarantine. You must have been like, dude, what are you doing? You know, like, why? Why do you guys keep coming? Maybe it wasn't the same ferryman, probably just making that story up in my head, but it's a good one. And so he crosses over the river into the quarantine. And I suppose he's bitten instantly because he dies. In 10 days he's dead. And so the course of the fever, the course of the disease is 4 or 5 days. So he's probably bitten almost instantly. This is working. He thank God, is able to give last rites to the dying priests there. And so, again, Shreveport is not ever without the sacraments during this time. No small thing in itself. Eventually he dies. And so we have just a few more minutes, so I'll have to talk about Levezoet super quick. Levezoet, again, native of France, gets over here. Levezoet was landed gentry in France. He was a rich boy. His family was very prosperous and well known. There was no reason for him to come to the wilds of Louisiana, were it not God's calling. He leaves all of that behind. Again, another educated man comes to Natchitoches. Natchitoches is a very interesting, cultural place, even to this day, especially at that time. But he gets there and he sees landed gentry, plantations, lots of wealth held by a small amount over a large amount of the population. Beautiful brick church. There's already schools and there's some things going on. And yes, he helps found some of that, but Natchitoches is pretty well established. Natchitoches has been Catholic since 1713. So it's not like he came to spread the gospel so much in Natchitoches. That's the sea city. Where he found his calling was in the woods, amongst some forgotten people, the people of Sabine. It was sort of a borderland. It was a place for outlaws. It was a place for poor folks. It was a place for people of mixed races and blood. They could live there out of scrutiny, and people would sort of let them be, but in a sense, they were isolated too in that arrangement. And so they had no church. They had no culture outside of the working farm, subsistence farming. And so what he loved, where his heart was, Levezoet's heart was amongst those people in the woods of Sabine. And so he would ride missions out there. And this is where he is when Natchitoches receives word of the epidemic and that someone's services are needed from Natchitoches to go to Shreveport. And so the bishop has to wait for him to come back from his mission, from Levezoet's mission trip. Just pacing, like, when's he coming home? I don't know. He's out there, he's with his people, what he loves to do. They love him. He's marrying, burying, baptizing, spreading the gospel. When he finally comes back. And I know the geography well because I lived in Natchitoches for 9 years. I went to Northwestern State University. And at that time, the way west came through the Catholic cemetery. The Catholic cemetery is up on a hill right there across from Immaculate Conception Church on 2nd Street. And so I can picture the bishop, pacing, waiting with those telegraphs, and seeing Levezoet coming on horseback. And we know he got there at the end of the day in the blazing Louisiana sun, as it's recorded, going through that Catholic cemetery, riding up to his bishop and seeing the bishop waiting there with a parcel of letters for him. He's been on horseback for 4 days already, or days already. I'm getting my horseback stories confused. He's been on horseback for days in the woods. The next day is going to be a Sunday. It's very important. He's very tired. It's very important to him to have another mass before he leaves. So he doesn't leave immediately like Cherbourg. That's a little impractical. He's been on the horseback for days. And he does leave the day after. But that scene is recorded by the bishop's own hands of him meeting as he's waiting for him to come back from his mission trip. And what is said is quite remarkable. The bishop hands the parcel of contents to Levezoet, and Levezoet reads them very deliberately, silently, folds them, looks at them one by one, takes in their contents. And the bishop says just the silence between them is just deafening and maddening, and he can't take it anymore. And he says, "What would you like to do, my son?" And he says he's embarrassed to even break the silence. And Levezoet says, "If it's up to me, I stay." And the bishop's like, "You're not supposed to say that. Where did that come from?" And Levezoet says, and he can see the bishop looking at him in the face, and the bishop says, I was reading his face, trying to discern the real meaning of his words. Those are the bishop's words. And Levezoet says, "Well, I want to go so badly that I'm worried it's my will, and it's not the will of God. I don't want to do anything that's not the will of God." I always get choked up there. So, the bishop, a holy man himself, is leveled. He doesn't know what to say. Just like me, choked up. He says, "I cannot believe the piety in front of me." And he just simply says, "Okay, go." Now, wouldn't it be a great Hollywood story if he got on the horse and kept going? But no, he wanted to say a mass, and we can't blame him. He's a priest. He's got to say a mass. He's got to say a mass. So he says a mass the next morning. He gathers his stuff. He says goodbye to some friends in the street, a very similar setting. The Vesulet is departing Natchitoches, I assume on 2nd Street, probably in front of the church, the rectory. All of that housing for the Catholic clergy and sisters is right along on that street at that time, so almost certainly where he was. A crowd is gathering, and one of them says, quote, "You go to your death." And the Vesulet stops, and he turns around and says, "I believe it, but it is the shortest path to heaven." And he goes. And of course, we know what happens to him. So, I'm well over time, so I guess I will end it there.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all for joining us Facebook Live and watching the video. Actually, right now, Dr. Cheryl White and I are literally about to get in a plane, which is why we're kind of rushing Ryan. Because tomorrow morning we'll be with the Nuncio, who is from Brittany, France. We're going to Washington, D.C. to the Nunciature, and the documentary people will be there as well because they're going to film him because he's going to be a prominent part of the whole documentary, all about the 5 priests. There's so much more that could be said. Go to the website, www.shreveportmartyrs.org, and you'll be able to see many more things, read more, etc. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for watching, and have a beautiful Sunday. Thank you.